Hi, this is Dr. Kessler. Welcome to Lecture 6, Strategic Planning Performance Measures. And sometimes I know it's hard to see what's on the screen because of my camera situation, but a little cartoon here says, "I can assure you, sir, the company is doing quite well despite what these figures say." And that's just what you might see sometimes when people do planning. So what are the major points we're going to cover in this lecture? We're going to talk about the issues that we've raised before, which is managers like to measure what they can control. They are averse to anything that can get them into trouble, and things that they don't exactly control possibly can do that. So managers will tend to like to measure activities, which they can control how many activities and what kinds of activities take place, and outputs, how many people get treated, etc. We're also going to talk about the use of outcomes and performance measures, and how outcomes are really the equivalent to what the private sector reports as annual profit. While in the public sector, it's outcomes that is, what are the impact or results or outcomes we're having as a program. So it really argues, for the money we've invested, here's the return that the taxpayers have gotten. We're going to talk about what constitutes a complete performance measurement model. And as you'll see, we'll need elements for input, budget, activities, costs, outputs, and outcomes. And we're going to need baseline measures and performance targets over time, all of which we're going to talk about in a second. We're also going to discuss outcomes being difficult to measure, because they certainly are, and outcomes really fundamental to the strategic planning process. And we're going to see that outcomes are really the goals that we're trying to achieve, and we're going to formulate strategies to achieve the outcomes. And once we have good outcomes, measurable outcomes, we can ask ourselves, do we have the right strategies to achieve that definition of success or outcome? And we'll talk about a approach that you might hear about in the literature and reading and online, called the balanced scorecard approach to performance measurement. So we've seen this chart before. It describes two viewpoints in an organization. One is down and in, and it suggests here that supervisors are incentivized to focus on their subordinate organizational units downward. And it also notes here that managers with a high need for control, which are a lot of managers, want to measure the things that they control, activities and outputs. But we've started to talk this semester about strategic planning as being the part of management that takes a look outside the organization and says, what's happening, and do we need to realign or adjust the organization to deal with it? We need to be sure that we understand that from a measurement perspective, when we measure the things that are up and out about the organization, we're measuring the things the organization influences, not the things the organization controls. So that's really important, focusing on what is the value proposition for this organization, why does it exist, how do we measure why it exists, and what can we do to make sure, to the best of our abilities, that our activities and outputs influence or cause outcomes to occur. Focusing on outcomes is inherently unnatural inside of organizations. And I usually use this diagram. It shows a running shoe production process in a factory. And if you can imagine the supervisor of raw material and buyers having performance measures, they're going to measure things like, did we get high quality raw material? Did we get it at a good price? The people in the factory responsible for cutting and shaping the raw material are going to be focused on minimum waste, making sure that we do our cutting and shaping in a highly efficient manner, that we do lots of quantity and high quality. The assembly folks are going to look at how many shoes they get assembled, quality of the shoes assembled, etc. The people who test quality are going to know how many tests they ran, etc. And the warehousing and shipping and accounting people are going to be measuring the number of product that they've packaged, number of product that they shipped, etc. So you can see that the managers of these different individual units are really focused on measuring what they do, not measuring outcomes. And yet, if you look across the entire process of running shoes, you have to ask yourself, well, what outcomes are we looking for? In order to see the outcomes you're looking for, you have to think about why people buy running shoes, because you certainly want to make profit. And the reason people buy running shoes is because they like the style of the running shoes, or they like the comfort of the running shoes. The running shoes make them faster. I would have, back in my marathon days, I would have paid a very high price for shoes if the shoes guaranteed to get me into the Boston Marathon. Unfortunately, I never found those shoes. The shoes that last a long time, shoes that promote good health, etc. And so the people in the organization who are doing the day-to-day activities really focus on measuring what they do, not measuring outcomes. So somebody in the organization has to have that strategic perspective of saying, in order for us to be successful, it doesn't matter about raw material and cutting and shaping and assembling and testing and warehousing and shipping. It matters that the product that comes out of these steps gives people a feeling of style, comfort, speed, durability, and health. And if that happens, then we'll make money in the private sector. You would say that. This diagram just shows, as we said before, that you start out spending money in organizations, and we do this in the government. We get a budget. We do activities. We do outreach. We do enforcement, etc. We produce outputs. We do fines or tickets or patients treated or whatever. And then the sequencing of outcomes begins to occur. We see behavioral changes in those we treated, and then once the behavioral changes occur, we get improved safety and health. And then because there's improved safety and health, public has more confidence, and we have more economic prosperity, and so on. Now notice the arrow going from the bottom left to the top right says that as you proceed through these boxes, you're shifting from controlling things to influencing things, and we've already talked about that. Measures that encourage wrong behaviors. One of the problems you run into when you're looking at measures is measuring wrong things. In academia, we sometimes evaluate our professor's success based on number of articles published. That has no bearing on whether the articles were quality articles published in good journals or whether those articles contributed to the body of knowledge. It's just number of articles, number of conference presentations, and you can see all the way down here, anytime you're counting the number of things that occur in the organization, you're measuring things that really encourage the wrong behaviors. They don't encourage creativity. They encourage people to do a certain number of things and activities. So you can sort of see how that looks. In terms of measuring outcomes, we mentioned earlier that it's hard to measure outcomes. It certainly is not easy, and I spent years and years and years helping organizations and spending a lot of think time trying to figure out the right kinds of outcomes. And you're going to see some of these examples of the results of this kind of work. We have a lecture coming up called Logic Models, and I'll show you lots and lots of examples of things that we did to help organizations measure outcomes. So recognize that it is difficult to identify outcomes. You have to kind of figure out, well, why was this agency created in the first place, and who's it trying to influence? What is it trying to do? I'll tell you, a lot of agencies, many agencies in the public sector, especially at the federal level, are trying to influence public confidence. And so, like the FAA wants people to be confident that they can fly safely. The law enforcement agencies want people to be confident that they can go outside and not be robbed and mugged. And so lots of our agencies are in that business. We get down to state and local, we get a little bit more focused on actually doing things that directly interact with people, like giving them driver's licenses, helping them be safe on the roads, etc. Also, when we can identify an outcome, sometimes we have, you think about it and you say, I can't think of a possible way to measure that. And so sometimes measuring outcomes requires surveys and interviews and expensive and time-intensive data collection techniques. And then other things, and I spent a lot of time thinking about surrogate measures or indices, like you hear on Wall Street about the Dow Jones Industrial Average went up today. Well, that's not a measure by itself. It's a composite of the stocks of a whole bunch of organizations, and it averages and tracks the movement of this entire set. And sometimes using indices and creating indices and using sets of measures to measure a bigger thing is necessary. So that's another issue. The benefits of having outcomes, you can talk to your stakeholders and your budget committees and say, look, we've dramatically reduced crime, we've reduced drug usage, we've increased the cleanliness of the streets, we've increased the safety of air travel. Whatever we do, we're talking to the stakeholders about why we need more budget, because that's usually why we're talking to budget committees. In terms of developing a strategic plan, as I mentioned at the beginning, if we have good outcomes identified, we can say, let's be very, very creative and innovative about the strategies that we want to have in order to achieve our outcomes. In terms of program evaluation, which is PUAD734 class, we can use outcome performance measures to say to what extent is the program achieving its intended outcomes, its intended goals. So lots and lots of good uses for outcomes. Real quick, I'll run through the steps in terms of just going through the process. First thing is to decide what to measure. We measure activities certainly for tactical purposes, because we want to make sure our people are doing lots of activities, and we do it for performance evaluation, so we can evaluate people on their performance appraisals. But we also measure outputs to focus on the organizational group-wise efficiency. Is the organization serving enough people? Is it getting the mail delivered on time? Is it doing what it needs to do? And then we measure outcomes not for internal day-to-day management and efficiency and effectiveness of the processes, but we measure outcomes to assess whether the organization, as it operates, is achieving its desired return on investment, and recognize that every program has many outcomes. Sometimes there's a tendency to go too far out to grab outcomes, and so you have to come back and think, well, what's the exact immediate impact or reaction to what we do? And then when that happens, what happens next? That's the immediate outcomes. And then because those intermediate things are occurring, ultimately, what could we say about how we're impacting the world? What's the ultimate outcome? Okay, determine how to measure. First you do what, and then you do how. Once the specific outputs and outcomes are selected, you have to develop the elements for each measure. And we'll talk about this in a couple of slides. You have to talk about the indicators for the measure, how we're going to measure it, what units. You have to talk about having a baseline, which is, okay, so what's the number now? What's the data now? And then you have to set targets. It can be annual targets or semi-annual targets, but the targets have to go over the strategic time frame. So we'll set annual targets for the next 5 years. And including the baseline measurements is very critical, because how can you measure change over time if you don't know where you are today? Recognize that it takes time to collect baseline information, and so we can't really wait till we get to the end of the strategic planning process and want to publish the plan to begin thinking about collecting baseline data. We've got to begin that early in the strategic planning process, because otherwise we'll not be able to get a plan published that has performance measures included in it. These are the basic elements of the performance measures measurement process. The performance measure itself, it's the characteristic that we're going to measure: the cost, the cycle time, the quality, the quantity, the impact on public health, the impact on public safety, number of cancer incidents, etc. Whatever we're measuring. And then for each measure, each one, we have a performance indicator, which is the unit of measure. Do we measure it dollars, hours, errors per thousand, number of reports per month? Do we measure it in terms of fatalities, public incidents, or whatever? And then we have a baseline, which is our initial measurement in those performance indicator units. And then we set our performance targets. Starting from the baseline measure, targets represent the performance goals. I also recommend adding an acceptable tolerance. And the reason tolerances are useful, like plus or minus 5%, is because generally senior leadership stays busy, and so they can say, look, as long as performance is within the acceptable tolerances, I don't need to be notified about it. But if the performance data starts to come in and is slipped outside of our acceptable range, then you should bring it to the attention of senior leadership or the Strategic Management Council or whatever. Okay, just a quick and ugly chart for measurement examples. You can see here it says outcomes, reduced patient process time. And how do we measure that? We measure it in terms of cycle time and number of errors. Again, it's an example. And the indicators, hours and minutes of processing time. and the error rate is the number of errors per 100. So the baseline was 7 hours and 10 minutes to process a patient, and we had 2 errors per 100. So we set targets, and you have to have dates with those targets. But we set the target to go from 7 hours and 10 minutes down to 20 minutes. Well, that's an ambitious target, right? And we want our error rate to go from 2 in 100 to 1 in 100. And we set tolerances to say, well, if I get to 30 minutes or 10 minutes, that's great. But if I fall outside the tolerance range, then this needs to be reported when it's measured. Improving patient satisfaction is a satisfaction survey. Indicators, a Likert scale, scale 1 to 5. Currently, we just did the satisfaction survey, and it's 2.1 out of 5. Not good, right? So we set a performance target to get that up to 4.5, and we'll have a tolerance range of a half point, so anywhere from 4 to 5 would be acceptable performance when we reach the target time frame. Nice thing about measurement like this, and thinking about measurement as baselines and targets, is you can measure performance over time, and you can track it in using charts like this. So you can sort of see how the dots might flow over time. This chart, I can't recall if we've seen this before or not in the class. This is one I developed to sort of show a new program had to do with parole and probation, and it was suggesting that by 2007, fiscal 2007, we wanted to reduce recidivism amongst probationers and parolees by 50%. So it's a new initiative, right? And so we're starting in 03, we're going to measure 04, 05, 06, and 07. And we're going to set out a budget for each of those years. That's the line that says budget. We're going to do activities starting in fiscal 03. We're going to develop the procedures and award the contracts, but we're not going to have any outputs and any outcomes because we're in the early stages. You can see the baseline level of recidivism is 88%. Then we get into next year, next fiscal year, budget $14 million. We start drug testing in addition to procedures and contracts, and we can start getting drug test results back. Now we have outputs. Still not seeing outcomes yet because we're only just starting to do drug testing, and so our recidivism rate is still at 88%. But now we get to the third year, fiscal 05, budget of $12 million. We add counseling and job placement to go with the drug tests, contracts, and the procedures. And we start to shoot for outputs of behavioral modification because now we have drug test results. And because we're working now with counseling and job placement and we're doing behavioral modification, we see some degree of success in terms of immediate outcomes. And so you can see the recidivism is now down to 70% in year 3. And then in year 4, we get $12 million. We put sanctions in place. This is in year 3, we had kind and loving and gentle. Now we've got tough love, sanctions. So now that we've added sanctions, we expect to see even more success, and we are hoping that our recidivism rate drops to 58%. That's a 30% drop in 4 years. And then we get to the last year with aggressive treatment, sustained outputs, achieving goal. Goal is 44%. That's a cutting recidivism in half over 5 years. Okay, so what do? We select the issues to measure. You can see I've got 1, 2, and 3 labeled. You can see on the right-hand side it says number 1, number 2. This is what we measure: customer satisfaction, timely, quality, unit cost. Those are all inputs, process, and activities. But what we really want to happen is on the left side, number 3. We want public confidence to increase, public health to improve. We want economic stability and health. We want quality of life. We want U.S. economic and political security. And we measure these things by per capita income, reduced crime, less illness, better cures, and robust economy. And so you can sort of see the model shaping up here with some examples of the kinds of things that we need to measure, and we do need to measure all of them. As I showed you on the prior chart, we want to measure what's happening in 1 and 2, and then show the linkage to number 3. So we need all of those to have a rich, robust measurement model. And so in order to select, we measure what we're trying to accomplish, our priorities. Optimal benefit is realized when measurement is used as a means of determining if adequate progress is being made. Things to emphasize when you're thinking about measurement is your main thing. Are you in the crime business, the health business, the national security threats business? Are you in the Indian tribe economic health and self-determination business? And I've had students in that business. Are you consumer safety threats? Are you in nuclear energy issues? Are you in the return on investment for space exploration business? So what is your main thing? What do you do? Remember, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. right? And so we look at, in that area, we look at high performance areas that will help us illustrate our program return on investment. And we look for issues that are requiring significant attention, our priorities based on the situational assessment, energy shortages, educational underachievement, and internal problems, which we'll talk about if we haven't already, timeliness, technology, staffing, etc. But we talk about those things in the right timing and the right time frame. And we'll cover that in detail. Okay, issue examples: U.S. Capitol Police were worried about new threats and vulnerabilities to the U.S. Capitol. That's why they put in the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center. Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, were focused on officers not getting refresher training and needing refresher training, so they were worried about officer safety being jeopardized. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had a 90,000 complaint backlog. I can tell you, if you have a 90,000 complaint backlog, you have no other strategic issue. That's your only strategic issue, and so on. So these are just examples. One thing I like to point out is that if you measure static things like a help desk response time, those things go up and down depending on the nature of the situation. And so you can sort of see here with the red line going across at 60 minutes. If our goal is 60 minutes or less response time, and you can see the actual in the black line there, what do you do with that? It's just sort of like it reminds me of having a goal that says continue to be excellent, right? This is the same thing. This is not a very useful static performance measure because of its static nature. Measuring progress, some issues are really broad, so you have to decompose them. I've spent a lot of years decomposing different kinds. Crime, you have to decompose it into what type of crime: violent crime, cyber crime, gang-related crime, child kidnapping crime, organized crime. What are we talking about here? Same with cancer. There's 175 types of cancer, and so which cancers do we want to focus on? What are our highest priorities? Which have the highest mortality rates, and which need the greatest level of research? In terms of economic health, it's too broad, so we break it down. We talk about education, we talk about transportation, employment, we talk about product safety. We have to talk about not product safety as a whole, but the products that pose the greatest threat. This approach works really well also for internal issues and breaking them down as well, and we'll get into that later. So we decide what to measure, we figure it out: violent crime, understanding what causes Alzheimer's disease, the large increase in number of income tax e-filings, student achievement. What is it we're going to measure? So we figure that out, and we plot that on the y-axis, as you can see here. How are we going to measure it? And what are our indicators, our units? Dollars, time, quantity, achievement scores. And so you set your baseline as sort of like the intersection of the x and y axis, as you can sort of see we did in this diagram. Then you add the x-axis, and along the horizontal x-axis you put time. And so we think of performance as movement over time. So if today we're at the y-axis and that's 0 or whatever number we are at today, we expect to be able to use data like this to be able to monitor movement over time. And as you can guess, as you start plotting your data, you're either going to improve your performance, it's going to stay the same, or it's going to go down. Sometimes going down is not a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing, especially if you're dealing with an issue that you want to decrease. And so you can sort of look at that and just recognize that equilibrium in organizations really tends to favor unchanged performance. That line that's going straight along the horizontal axis and is in dark black. And so we sort of think about performance as movement between sort of a current level and some desired performance level over time. We can plot it, forecasted performance over time, and then we can look at our actual performance over time. We do this with budget charts all the time. What's our budget line and what's our actual budget spending, and is there a gap? Now, if you have a gap, of course, you can use gap analysis to be able to figure out why the gap occurs. And that's what this slide says. It says when expected and actual performance diverge, it's time for leadership to take action. And that's why performance measurement is so important to strategic planning. That we had some things we wanted to accomplish, and we set out on a quantitative measurement pathway to measure the progress in accomplishing them, and we've deviated. We've either exceeded or we've underperformed or whatever, and so now we have to take action. It's not a punitive action, it's an organizational positive action. So we can say, if we didn't achieve the performance actions, why didn't we achieve them? Is it because we had the wrong strategies, or the strategies didn't work, or we didn't execute the strategies well? And what can we do to get the performance back on track? And once we sort of get to that point, we can use the information to adjust expectations. Maybe we lower the targets, right? Or maybe we add more resources. And this helps because it enables the doers in the organization, those who have to get things done, to feel like the leaders in the organization are behind them. They've recognized that for whatever reasons, the issues, the performance is not going to be achieved. And also it enables them to be able to say, I'm on your side, I'm going to help you get this done. So benefit of measurement helps us think critically about what we're trying to accomplish and what we're doing, and are they connected correctly. It helps us think about innovation. It helps us be innovative and think of innovative ways to achieve performance. Enables us to coordinate with others, especially if we're working on joint activities. Measures are simply a means to push performance to the next levels, what it says here, which is absolutely true. And what we really want, though, is not measurement. We want strategies, we want solutions, we want innovation, and we want creativity. Those are the things we want, and measures are help us get there. Now this chart, I know it's hard to see. We're going to come back to it later when we talk about implementing action plans for different goals and strategies. And so it's a very busy chart when you look at it on the screen, but you can see at the top it says Goal 1, strengthen the economic well-being of IT professionals. I made that up, right? And so maybe we've got two objectives or performance goals. And so maybe by the end of fiscal 01, we want to increase employment opportunities for IT programmers by 25%. And maybe by the end of fiscal 02, we want to increase the per capita income of IT professionals by 12%. If we made those, I made those up. And there's a little discussion space in there to say, well, IT professionals face a lot of challenges in terms of strengthening their economic well-being, including .com failures and demanding customers and pressures to wear formal business attire and so forth. Now, I made this up. It's intended to be kind of funny. And so we come down and we look at the overall performance measures, and we wanted to measure employment opportunities and per capita income. We look and see in fiscal 01 that we have 7 vacancies per IT professional, and they make $87K. So in fiscal 02, the objective is 9 vacancies and $96,000 a year. And fiscal 03, it's 11 vacancies, probably 11 vacancies and $101,000 per year. So we've set out our performance targets, and down the left side, then you see the strategies. Make the case for hiring more IT folks in strategy 2 and strategy 3 and so on. What obstacles are in the way of achieving these strategies? Well, the economic downturn, the economic awareness. So now we have to have an action plan. So what actions are we going to pursue? What actions are we going to do with in the particular programs, and what actions are we going to do at the agency level? And how will we measure progress in achieving strategies? And do we need new resources? So that's a very busy chart. We'll come back to it later because I think you need to see it in a little bit more detail, but it's a very useful implementation kind of a chart. So once you have your measures in place, time to leverage and implement and make sure that if performance is not on track, we have to ask ourselves some questions. Do we really have the right targets? Are the strategies valid? Are the strategies working? Or are things beyond our control impacting our ability to make progress? And based on the answers, we have to take action and make decisions. And Excel, right? That's what we want to do. So one last point, and I'll shut up for this evening. Many agencies have adopted a method to measure performance called the balanced scorecard, pioneered by a couple of Harvard business types, Kaplan and Norton, back in '92 and '96. And I know these guys. And what they said was that the middle of the model is the vision and the strategy you want to achieve. And then we want to measure customer satisfaction things on the left, financial things on the top, internal processes on the right, and then learning and growth of our workforce at the bottom. And so a lot of agencies have adopted this and paid money for big-time consultants to come in and implement it. Now, I have a significant problem with this approach in the balanced scorecard in that it is very, very internally oriented. It's oriented towards the people and the processes and the money. And it's not oriented towards outcomes unless you can squeeze it in over there on the customer measurement side. And so Dr. K says if you are in an agency using balanced scorecard, you need to make sure that the scorecard does not take you down and in unintentionally. Okay, so just recognize that. And so the scorecard folks would suggest that once you have a strategy to achieve, that you then list the financial measures, the customer measures, the process measures, and learning and growth measures. I would argue later that there's a different way to do this, and what I would suggest is, just as it says here, that we do the vision the way we said, we do the outcomes and goals the way we said, and we come up with our strategies the way we said, and then we sort of look at these balanced scorecard metrics in the bottom boxes. So I'll mention this again at the end of the semester. It's not terrible, but you need to be careful. You need to keep in mind what I've been trying to suggest this semester, which is first we got to focus on the strategic challenges to the agency and organization. And once we set those up, and we then come back and we will ask ourselves, and I promise we'll get to this, do we have the right people, the right morale, the right leadership, the right resources, the right technologies to achieve what we're trying to achieve here? We'll get to that. Okay, so what we've covered in performance measurement is the fact that managers like to measure what they control. They're very uncomfortable with measuring outcomes, and so that's an important part of the training and the selling process of performance measurement. Outcomes are useful. They communicate return on investment to taxpayers, so we really have to have them. That there's a complete way to measure things. We're going to need a mix of inputs, activities, outputs, and outcome measures, and each measure is going to have an indicator. It's a unit. It's going to have to have a baseline. It's going to have performance targets over time. Recognize also, we talked about outcomes are difficult to identify and often difficult to measure. We didn't get into enough detail on that because a lot of times these recordings that I do, I have to keep them short in order to be able to get them uploaded to YouTube. Outcomes are important to the strategic planning process. They really are. They enable us, when we add outcomes, to be able to come back and say, do we have the right strategies to be able to achieve the outcomes? And once we get measures, we really know in a sharp way what the outcomes are. And then we talked a little bit about the balanced scorecard approach, which we'll talk about again this semester. That's the end of the performance measurement lecture. We have other lectures ahead. We have one on strategies, which I think you'll enjoy. We have another one on logic models, and that was my cat telling me it's time to turn off the camera.